Am I live? Alright, cool. Hi guys. My name's Ben, and I'm a sound engineer, audio designer. I mix films and music and bands live and in the studio. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about mixing. I'm aiming this towards people who've done a little bit of mixing before or know a little bit about it, towards kind of intermediate sort of people. Kind of aiming at that I'm in a band and I've tracked some stuff in my bedroom and I want to put it in YouTube or Instagram, or I want to send it to promoters and I just want to make it sound a little bit better. So I've been thinking about how the best way is to kind of deliver all of this. I think the best thing to do is take you through a mix. Nothing complicated, just incorporating some basic mixing skills. And then showing you how I've applied all of those to kind of have the main end product. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you will be able to see my Logic file. Is that working? And you can hear my Logic file, yeah? Cool. Okay, so mixing is a bit of an art form. I know that sounds a bit pretentious, but it is. So this is a bit of a disclaimer. There's absolutely no hard and fast rules with what you're doing. So just because I do something doesn't mean it's going to necessarily work in your mix. And I know that's a bit of a pain in the ass to hear, and it bummed me out when I first heard it, but that is how it is. And everybody mixes to taste, and it totally depends on what genre you're mixing in and all of that. So first I'm going to start off with a vocal line, because I assume that's what most people are recording in their bedrooms. Then we're going to move to a drum mix. So the stems I'm using is from a song called Doomed by Bring Me the Horizon. It's beautifully recorded, beautifully edited, which is really nice. So I'm just going to play you the unmixed version of this.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge, 'cause my head is in overdrive. I'm sorry, but it's too late, and it's not worth saving. So come rain on my parade. I think we're doomed. I think we're doomed. And now there's no way back.
Cool. So that's the unmixed version of those chorus vocals. So that's what you would get from the recording studio normally, or what you would get as just like flat out audio stems. All I've done there is balance the volumes and then bounce them down to a single track. Cool. And now I'll show you the end product after I've mixed it.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge, 'cause my head is in overdrive. I'm sorry, but it's too late, and it's not worth saving. So come rain on my parade. I think we're doomed. I think we're doomed, and now there's no way back.
Cool. So that's my mixed version of that. I mixed this in context with the track, so it sounds a bit weird hearing it out of context with the track, but that's what a mixed vocal file will sound like. This is a really, really cool piece because it's got so much going on in it. So there were two singers, there's Ollie and Jordan, and they both have really, really similar voices, like really in the same kind of frequency ranges, and it's, like I said, been fantastically recorded. So up at the top here, I've got the three main lines.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge.
And then below this, in tracking, they've recorded loads and loads and loads of backing vocals and harmonies, loads of falsetto parts, low parts.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge.
Which is really, really nice. And that's definitely a tracking tip when you're recording at home, you know, if you're doing a demo or something. It's very, very rare that if you're in a professional studio, you'll do one take on one line of a vocal, and that will be all the engineer uses. So it's really nice to kind of really stack your vocals. And because of that, they're very, very slightly out of time, which is what you'd expect from a natural performance. And it gives this nice little phasey effect, which is quite interesting. It's really, really subtle, but it's definitely there. And I picked this especially because it has so many vocal tracks and in a similar frequency ranges, which means you can apply your processing on the mix bus instead of just inserting them on every channel, which is a much more efficient way to work, and it makes your general track sound much more cohesive rather than adding EQ and compression and all of this kind of thing over every single track. That can end up muddying it. It can all sound a bit squashed. So just by processing on the bus is the best way to do that. So basically all I've done is I've got all these tracks, created a summing stack, which is a bus basically, which is then being sent out to my stereo out, which you can see here, bus 6 output to my stereo out. Cool. So the first kind of main technique you're going to use in mixing across the board is EQ. For those of you that don't really know what EQ is, or have kind of heard of it but not really sure what it does, EQ is a spectrum of frequencies that's created by your sound source. So every piece of audio is made up by a bunch of frequencies. Basically, it sounds a bit unprofessional, but that's kind of what it is. And what EQ does, it either boosts or cuts frequencies. So up here, I've got a little spectrum analyzer, just your stock one in Logic. And when I play it through, you'll be able to see the frequencies come up.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it.
Cool. So you can see the spectrometer catching all of those frequencies there and then showing it visually. So EQ, in terms of mixing, I'm using it in a corrective sense, to correct things that are wrong. Maybe you've got some low end in the piece that doesn't need to be there. Sometimes, say your vocals and your guitars are sitting on top of each other, they're sharing too much of the same frequency range, so you've got to do some carving to try and get rid of, trying to get some separation in there. So you've got additive and you've got subtractive EQ. Additive would make sense, you're boosting your EQ. Subtractive, you're taking away from your EQ. You're taking away frequencies. And I tend to stick to subtractive EQ just because normally, especially in quite a dense mix like this, normal rock mixes, there's a lot going on, especially in this, when you've got the whole project open. There's something like 95 files of huge guitars and synths and all of that kind of thing. So subtractive EQ is definitely the way to go. Luckily, this has been beautifully recorded, so the acoustics in the room are incredible, so you haven't got to do too much correcting here. But I'll just walk you through what I've done on these vocals. So I've low cut up to around 100 Hertz, 95 Hertz for the vocals. Anything below this, it's just kind of going to be rumble in the microphone from the room, all of that kind of thing. And you just don't need it in the mix at all. I've also made a small move here. I'm cutting 5 dB at around 350 Hertz. This is really, really subtle. This is because there's quite a lot of breathiness in these vocals. Normally this kind of frequency range is where all the beef of the music is, so all the beef of the voices, and you don't want to do too much extreme cutting there. But this is quite a harsh vocal. He's kind of on the edge of screaming. He's really, really pushing it, and there's quite a lot of, that breathiness from his lungs there. So I've just made a little trim there, and then I've made a small cut, another 5 dB cut around 1K. That's probably a little bit wide, but there was just a little bit of harshness there. So yeah, that's the cuts I've made. So I'll play it without the EQ, and then with the EQ, so without.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge.
And then with the EQ.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it.
So as you can hear, it's definitely subtle moves. And for me, that's the key to mixing. It's a collection of subtle changes that make your track sound good. You do anything too extreme, which is unneeded, and it tends to stick out a bit like a sore thumb, and it can be really difficult to balance with the rest of the piece. At least in studio work, that's kind of the approach I found. And then another just little EQ move I made on this bus. So this is a dynamic EQ by Waves, I believe. And this is very similar to the last one. So this EQ cuts those frequencies all the time. This I've set to take a little cut around 8 dB when the volume surpasses a certain level, so at your threshold. And I've made this cut. There's a little bit of kind of like harshness in the mic, you know, in that vocal line, which is expected because, you know, he's kind of giving it everything. And they've chosen quite a bright kind of poppy mic. It's a really kind of bright piece. So I've just made a little trim there. So I'll just show you without and with.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it.
With.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it.
So again, it's subtle, and I don't want that cut to be there all the time because I really like how crisp and clear this top end is. It's just when he really, really goes for it, it gets quite harsh and quite ice picky in the mic. So yeah, I've set threshold kind of just at that border. So a question I had when I first started mixing, I'd see everybody's kind of EQ moves and all their parameters, and I think, okay, well, that's cool, but I'm not sure how I got there. And when you've just started mixing, that's a really valid question to have because it's, you know, if your ears aren't used to listening out for problem frequencies and all that kind of thing, it can definitely be an issue. So, finding wrong frequencies. I'm just going to turn off the rest of my plugins here. Actually, no, I'm going to go on the unmixed. Just.
So
cool, here we go. So I'm just going to put an EQ on here. Cool. So, a really good way to kind of like start off is to identify whereabouts in your frequency range is the problem. Is it in your lows? Is it in your low mids, your mids, high mids? Is it in your highs, or is it kind of like in your air frequencies up here? That's a good place to start. You know, are you hearing too much rumble? Is something too kind of in your face? Is something feeling a little bit muddy? Is it a bit boxy? So yeah, just use your ears at first to identify the general area of the problems. And then once you've found that general area, then create a curve, and I tend to use Additive EQ for this just because it really picks up on the problem areas. Bring it up about 10 dB max. Any more than this and everything is going to start sounding rubbish. Narrow the Q. So the Q is the width of frequencies. So you can see that this is now really narrow. That's a really wide Q. And what you're going to do, you're just going to bring it across your frequency spectrum and just listen out for the noise that sounds wrong. So the part of this that sounds, you know, bad to the ear. So I'll just do a really quick example here.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge. 'cause my head is in overdrive. I'm sorry, but it's too late, and it's not worth saving. So come rain on my parade.
So, you know, like I said when I was going through my actual EQ, I'm hearing some kind of like breathiness down in this kind of lower mid section, which I don't really want, because that's, you know, it kind of darkens up the vocals and it's going to get in the way of the guitars and the bass, you know, all of this nice kind of like juicy low end down here. So I found that here, and I'm just going to pull it down. I'm going to make a small cut. So, listen to it.
So come rain on my parade.
You can hear that it's just a little bit, you know, again, small moves, but it has made it mostly better. And when you make small moves across the board, it will be a real change. Again, you know, comment section's open, so if you want to ask me anything, if you want me to go slower, speed up, just give me a shout. Cool. Then the next thing I'm going to be talking about is compression, which is kind of like the second most common thing to use in a mix after EQ. So what a compressor does, a compressor is a dynamic processor. And what it does, it turns down your signal, turns down your audio by a certain chosen amount after a certain point of loudness. And it can be used in basically every situation. Well, mostly. So in this case, I'm just using it really, really subtly, just to trim some of the top dynamics off this. So here you can see my dial, and I think I'm taking around 2 dB off.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me up.
Yeah, so I'm not even taking that much off. I really like the dynamics in these vocals. They're really, they've really thought about how they're tracking it. They've really thought about the performance. So I didn't want to take away too much from that and make it sound all squishy. I just wanted to, just to make it sound a little more cohesive and just take off those top dynamics. So inside a compressor, you're going to have, some very, very common parameters inside here. So first of all is your threshold. Your threshold level is the volume at which your signal is going to be turned down by your chosen amount. So if you've got a low threshold, your compressor is going to kick in much sooner than if you have a high threshold. So I've got a threshold of around -8 dB, so it's fairly low. And then your ratio, that is how much you're turning your signal down once it's surpassed that threshold level. So I'm only taking a tiny little bit off. I'm a 1.5 ratio, which really isn't that much. And then when you have a totally flat ratio, that's when it becomes a limiter. So it just blocks it off completely. Your attack setting is how fast your compressor is going to act on your signal. And your release is the opposite. Your release is how fast it's going to return to your unaffected level. And depending on your attack and your release, you can really change the tone of your signal. So I've gone for a fairly fast attack because it's quite an aggressive vocal performance. And I just wanted to clamp down on some of those harsher transients, but not so fast that it's really kind of, it's not really pushing the compressor, and again you lose all that dynamic. So you're still getting the nice open dynamic of the performance, but it's just taming that transient slightly. And then the release, I have quite a slow release. Can't really remember what my thinking was there, but it seemed to work when I did it. So I'll play it with and without the compressors. So without.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge. 'cause my head is in overdrive.
And then with the compressor.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge.
So as you can see from this dial, it's being turned down a little bit, a fairly healthy amount, but it's not doing anything. It's not like a really, really slammed pop vocal, you know, where it sits totally flat in the mix and there's no dynamic. It's I'm still keeping the dynamics, and because I am using parallel compression as well, that does make up for some push, which I'll get onto in a little bit. What am I doing here? Right, actually, let's talk about parallel compression now. So parallel compression is a technique used by sound engineers, mainly in the studio setting. You can use it live, but the issue is using it live. If you've got a cheaper desk, you can get latency, and if the desk can't handle it, it starts sounding really mushy, and there's a delay between what's coming off stage and what's coming out of the PA. So it's something I tend to keep for the studio setting. And all it is that you're creating a mix bus. So here I'm on mix bus 7. Sorry, let me find this. So on my main 3 vocals, I've made a mix bus of mix bus 7, and I'm sending a healthy amount of signal to this aux channel here. So what mix bus compression does is that you're sending the signal. Oh, sorry, I'm explaining this very well. You're sending the signal out of your main kind of line of processing. You're splitting it off, and then you're slamming it really, really hard with a compressor, which is then being sent to the main output, same as your last signal. And then you're blending it in to taste. And this is really, really good if you want to have a kind of a smoother vocal line, but you want to retain the dynamics, which is what I'm doing here. Or if you've got quite a dense mix, again, what I'm doing here, and you just want those vocals to sit on top kind of consistently throughout the mix. So here you can see I've set the threshold fairly high. The ratio is on 3:1. So yeah, you can see the settings there. And I'll just play a few.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the.
As you can see, I'm knocking it off by about 10 dB, which is a really, really extreme amount of compression, and I wouldn't normally do this on my main bus, but as it's something you can blend in on a separate fader down here, it works really, really well. Here I'm using the virtual mix rack stuff by Slate, and I'm using a bunch of other plugins, but you can use whatever you want. You can use what's stock in GarageBand or Logic or whatever you're using. So I'll just play it with and without. So without.
So come rain on my parade.
With.
So come rain on my parade.
There you can hear it just adds a lot more push and a lot more stability under those vocals, which I really, really like, because sometimes vocals can sound a little bit weak depending on the performance or the way they're tracked or the way they're edited. So yeah, that's what I like to use there. So I'm just going to read the questions quickly. Cool. So just been asked, are all these so no. Okay, so I've just been asked if these moves are specific to any particular genre of music. No, they're not. You can use these kind of across the board. Like I said at the start, it's definitely these techniques are something you choose to use out of taste, and if you think they're needed. Like I said, there's no right or wrong, but I've tried to find techniques that are fairly, universal across the board. So it doesn't matter if you're doing an indie band, or if you're, doing a Ben Howard folky acoustic thing, or if you're mixing metalcore or a rock track like this. They're all fairly standard moves. So yeah, parallel compression is definitely a good move to make. And it's also really good for using with drums, a kick, or reinforcing a snare. Definitely really good, depending again on what sort of music you want to use it for. Really good for metal. You know, when your kick really wants to be in your chest and the snare's got to be really cracking, and they're much further to the front of the mix than, say, it would be in an indie track. So yeah, it's definitely something to keep in mind. And then obviously blend into taste. Cool, what am I using after this? Okay, so the last thing in my main processing chain is just a bit of a saturator, again by Slate Digital. And all this is doing is thickening up, is putting more frequencies into kind of the low mids. I know that sounds a little bit counterintuitive because earlier I made a cut to the low mids, but I thought it needed a little kick in, you know, the right direction. And there's a little bit of what they call shimmer, which is just a little bit of presence, just to make those vocals bite through the mix. So again, I'll just play it with and without.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it.
With.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it.
Again, a really subtle move, but in the context of a mix, you know, it's these subtle moves that make all the difference. Cool. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is applying effects to a vocal chain, or actually not just a vocal chain, to any sort of chain, but a vocal part is normally where most of your effects processing comes in. Cool, so for this example I'm using a reverb and a delay, which are both, you know, your kind of bog standard vocal effects. And again, I'm running these on a bus, which I find gives me a huge amount more control in terms of blending in and automation and just kind of being a bit more hands-on with it, compared to if I just put it in the front of a vocal chain where everything's being affected by that. This way I can have some clean signal going through, which really, really bites. Then I can have this really heavily affected signal sitting underneath, and I can blend into taste. Same sort of ideas as I had with the parallel compression, but instead of being a compressed signal, you're now having an affected signal. Cool, so I'll start off with the vocals. So I've got bus 8 and bus 9 set up here, which I'm sending to this auxiliary track. And I'm using H-verb and H-delay by Waves, which I really, really like. I'll give you the parameters in a moment. So I'll play you with and without these effects. I know, but I think it's the best way to hear these moves. So without.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it.
It sounds good, but it's a little dry. There's no space around it. You know, it sounds like someone's singing to a microphone. It doesn't sound, you know, like you're in a concert hall. There's no experience behind that. That's how I like to think of it. And then with.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it.
So you can hear the tail there. So I'll start off with the reverb. So like I did for the compression, sorry, unlike I did for the compression, all of the vocal tracks are being sent to this reverb, not just the main ones, not just the main upfront vocals. I'm sending it pre-fader to, where am I? To here, where I'm using an H-verb. And again, reverb is one of those things that's got to be adjusted to taste. Not all reverbs are going to work in all contexts. I really, really like reverbs with a long tail, you know, really kind of lush sounding reverbs. But obviously that's always appropriate, but I think it works quite well in this instance, as it's quite a, you know, it's a bit of an anthem sort of song. It just kind of ties everything together quite nicely. So inside my reverb, a few things. I've got pre-delay, build-up size, trail, dry wet mix, and output. So I'll go through these quickly. The pre-delay is probably one of the most important parts when you're mixing reverb for vocals, and all that means is how much time fact is the reverb going to come in. And I know that sounds a bit odd, but it's really, really important, because if your reverb comes in right on that initial transient, you're going to muddy it up slightly, especially if you're blending it high in the mix. So what I tend to do, you can see it on this graph actually, you can see where the initial transient comes in, that's this white waveform here, and I started the reverb to come in just after that. So you've got enough time for that initial transient to come through before you start affecting it with the signal. Then you've got build up and size, which are kind of other parameters here. You're not going to find those on every reverb, but you know, size of the reverb, and then how dense that reverb is, basically. Your trail, which is how long your reverb tail is going to go on for. Then your dry wet, which is the percentage of the signal you want affected. Because I've got this on a separate bus, I've put it all the way up to wet, so I can mix in a really lush signal. And then output, so the volume of your output. Let's see if I can do this. So I'll just play the end so you can see the trails off.
I think we're through, and now there's no back.
So you can hear the trail I've got there. It's a pretty long trail. It's about half a, but I've mixed it in pretty low. So the lower you mix it in, I find the longer trail you can get away with. If you mix it too high, everything sounds like you're just shouting in a cave, and you know, you lose all of that vocal presence and everything that you kind of worked so hard for in the EQ. And so it's really, really important to blend it in sensibly, basically. Normally, you know, if I can't find the reverb I really, really like, I can't get it to sound exactly how I want it, I'll put an EQ after my reverb. So, but in this instance I haven't. The reverb's worked really nicely, but it's something I really commonly do. So say your reverb is really, really nice, but it's just got a bit too much brightness in it. It sounds a little bit fizzy in the mix, and you just want to take out some of that kind of the top end clarity, and maybe a little bit too rumbly as well. You want to focus that range, if that's what you're going for. Then I would make a move here in line on the reverb bus. So say I'd just bring the high shelf down a little bit, and then bring the low shelf down a little bit. And again, nothing too drastic, but I'll be focusing reverb frequencies in the middle here. And it's important to note that what you're doing on this bus doesn't affect the EQ moves that you've made on your main vocal bus. So I'll just play, you know, with and without. Oh, there we go.
So parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge, 'cause my head is in overdrive. I'm sorry, but it's too late, and it's not worth saving. So come rain up.
You can really hear there, you know, just by, I've done an extreme case here to kind of make an example, but by cutting around these reverb frequencies after the reverb, it's much easier to focus in the mix where you want it. So that's quite a useful move. Okay, cool. Couple questions. I will answer the questions. First of all, Ash Cook, nice to see you, Ash. Black Friday deals. Anything I recommend? So Waves always has many deals on, so I wouldn't be too worried. But their stuff's really, really good. But I hugely recommend the Slate Digital Virtual Mix Rack stuff. It is by far the best stuff on the market. It's a £10 a month or something like that. It's ridiculously good. And then Isotope actually have some really good deals on. I got the Imager, which I'll demonstrate really quickly. It's actually on one of these tracks. Where have I put it? I put it on this ambient kind of pad vocal track right at the bottom. And what it does, yeah, this one. So it just brings everything out through your stereo space, which I'll go on to explain a little bit more of in a minute. So. So you can see that before it was all quite centralized in the middle. You know, not necessarily sounding mono. It's a stereo file, but this just brings everything out to the sides and it just creates a better stereo image. Then Will, hey Ben, what made you send pre-fader on these vocals, and when would you choose to send post-fader? Good question. Pre-fader and post-fader. Cool. For people who don't know what pre-fader and post-fader means, so basically this is your fader, that's your volume level, and you can choose to send signal out from your vocals, not just vocal channel, out of your audio channel to your bus in a number of different places. So I'm choosing to send it pre-fader, which means that the vocal, the signal is leaving that channel before it gets to the fader. And the reason I did this is because it doesn't matter if I change the level of my main vocal, the effect is going to drop and rise by the same amount. So if I show you, it's probably easier to show you rather than explain it. So here I am.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge, 'cause my head is in overdrive.
So as you can see there, it doesn't matter what I do with that main volume for my vocals. The ratio of signal that is going out to my sends with the effects on, with the compression on, is going to move with the volume. I explained that terribly, I hope that makes sense. So yeah, it's a nice way, so you set a balance you want between the clean and the wet signal, and then it doesn't matter what you do with your main fader, that balance is going to stay the same, is a better way to explain it. If you're sending it post-fader, you are going to lose that balance. If you're sending post-fader, it doesn't matter how much you change that main master fader, the amount of signal being sent to your buses are going to be the same, so you lose that balance. I'm trying to think of an example when I would use it post-fader. Maybe if I was doing something like a big delay throw, you know, on a breakdown or a scream or something like that, or I was doing, you know, kind of a soundscapey ambient bit for a film or something like that, I would send it post-fader, you know, where you really want, it's really hard to explain, where you really kind of want less control of it, you want it to be a little more random. That's how I tend to think about it. People think about it in different ways, but that's kind of how I tend to do it. I know it sounds a bit ambiguous and a bit odd, but that's kind of my approach to sending pre and post fader. I recommend when you start, you send pre-fader. Otherwise, you're going to be wondering for a while, why do your mixes sound really, really weird when you turn the volume of everything down, or you make small tweaks and then you have to go back for hours rerouting everything, which is just never fun. So yeah, I hope that answers your question a bit, Will. So yeah, I just talked about the reverb. I chose to play reverb just because I found they're really nice on vocals. And then I'll move on to the delay. So exactly the same concept as the bus sends for the reverb and the compression. Here I'm using H delay by Waves. I love it. I made the mistake of not mapping the tempo of this vocal to the project. So it took me ages to find a good delay time. And delay is one of these things that I hear a lot of engineers using way too much on vocals and in their mixes, and it can really, really muddy up your mix and kind of defeat the whole point of separating anything, separating anything in a stereo spread or separating it by EQ, just because you tend to find that delays add frequencies, they're quite dense, often they're stereo anyway, so they do make life a little more, trying to find the word, sorry. It makes everything sound a little more dense and muddy if you mix them too high in the mix or you use it inappropriately. Because a lot of the time guitars will track with delay or put delay on after the fact and then be printed in. So if you've got a bunch of different delays going on, then it can be too much. But in this context, I thought it was appropriate, again, because same reason I'm using the long tail delay. So the long tail reverb, it's a bit of an anthem sort of piece, and I thought it sounded really good. So I'll just play the end part where you'll be able to hear the delay in practice.
And now there's no way back.
I'll just turn it up really, really high, just so you really get the point of what the delay is doing.
There's no way back.
Cool. So, like I was saying about the reverb, I'm sending it pre-fader to this bus, and then blending it in as I like it. I'm keeping it pretty low in the mix for reasons I mentioned before. I don't want it to muddy up anything. I really like the initial transients in this piece, the attack they have in it, and if your delay's too high in the piece, it can take it away. So I'm just going to play it from the beginning, just with and without. Work the delay with that.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge.
And then with.
So come rain on my parade, 'cause I wanna feel it. Come shove me over the edge.
So you can hear the tails there. So it's mixed pretty low, but I quite like it because it just gives a little bit of like an ambient push to the piece. And if you know this song is full with pads and string sections, and in the context, it was working really, really well. I've got it labeled as Vox delay, but I was sending all the pads to this and the string section and some of the guitars to it, but with a much smaller signal, just to make everything sound a little bit more uniform, but again, I didn't want it to sound muddy. Cool, so that's kind of the mix rundown of the vocals for Doomed. I hope that kind of helped you guys a little bit. I think the main messages for mixing vocals is small cuts. You don't want to do anything too drastic in your EQ, otherwise it's going to really, really affect the balance of the rest of your piece. Again, with compression on your main front end, be quite sparing with it. You don't want to slam anything too hard unless you're doing a really overproduced pop piece. If you've got dynamics in the track, be very wary that you're not taking away from the artist's intending. So yeah, be sparing with that. And then in terms of effects and routing processing, your parallel compression is a fantastic way to push your vocals on top of a mix, especially if you've got quite a dense mix going on. You want it to really, really punch, but you don't want to flatten all those dynamics on the front end. You can blend in really, really nicely to get a kind of nicer push, especially if you're using a warmer compressor like this. It really kind of tightens up everything in your low to high mid-range without kind of making anything too boomy or again having that over presence ice picky kind of bit. So I recommend you use a warm compressor for that. Again, do some research on the internet or just flick through your compressors and see what you like. And then reverb and delay. Again, adjust to taste. Try and get it in time. Try and get the reverb in time to the piece. Sorry, try and get the delay in time to the piece. And make sure that you're not mixing it too high, because I know it's a lot of fun to slap loads and loads of effects on it, but you'll find that as soon as you unmute everything and you're mixing in context, that you're going to have this world of noise that you can't really change unless you're going right back to basics. So it's much easier just to be kind of sensible and preserved with it from the start. Cool. So that's doomed, which I really, really like. So I was just going to move on and talk about mixing drums, because the way I mix drums live and mix drums in the studio is very, very similar. The way you mix vocals live and mix vocals in the studio can be quite different, because obviously you've got a lot of changing factors when you're live. You've got singers who may not be experienced, cupping microphones and all of this kind of stuff, so you're having a really, really different frequency response through a dynamic microphone into your desk than you would be with a singer in a fantastically acoustically treated room, with a really, really nice condenser mic getting all that top-end detail. On stage, they're going to be running around, they're going to be jumping over monitors, all of this kind of thing. So you've got to watch, your feedback, your gaining, all of this kind of thing. And often live, I tend to mix the vocals brighter, because when you listen to music, you're normally on speakers or you're in your headphones. You've got a much better response and you're in a closed atmosphere. When you're live, you're competing with room acoustics, you're competing with everybody talking in the room, you're competing with on-stage noise versus what's coming out of your PA. So I tend to mix them quite a lot brighter live, just to cut through mud, especially if it's a heavy band or a denser band with a lot of gain and all this kind of thing. But my approach to drums is fairly similar across the board. And my number one tip for drums is panning. Makes all the difference. Really, really brings it alive, and I'll go through that in a moment. And mixing cymbals. So many kind of new engineers, or guys in college, all of this kind of thing, mix their cymbals so high in the mix, and it's definitely because they're trying to aim for what they think a kit should sound like in a room. And a kit sounds fantastic in a room, but just because it sounds great in a room doesn't mean it's going to sound great in a mix. So obviously, cymbals are kind of like the brightest part of the kit, maybe with the exception of a snare, depending on what sort of snare and cymbals you're using. And that really, really travels and cuts through a mix. And if you're mixing them way too high, it can take up all the presence, all the nice high mids where the vocals should be sitting, where maybe your string sections or whatever. So always mix your cymbals back slightly. Actually, I'm not going to say always, because obviously there's exceptions. If the majority, if you're a jazz drum and your whole performance is an intricate hi-hat pattern, obviously don't mix that back then. But if you're talking about a large rock anthem or something like that, do try and keep your cymbals mixed back and your room mics. So that's my little rant about people mixing cymbals too high over. And then tip number 3 for mixing drums is identify what's important in your mix. So kind of going off my last point. Are you prioritizing your snare? Are you prioritizing the kick? Is it the relationship between the kick and the snare? Have you got loads and loads of ghost notes going in the drummer? Is it an intricate piece? Is it a big bangy blues piece? Is it what are you trying to achieve? Never mix a drum kit. No one ever mixes a drum kit same twice, just because very, very different applications to what you want to do. So let's have a quick drink. Cool. So these are the drum samples from Preposition by Periphery, tracked by, I think his name's Matt Halpin, never remember his name. It's recorded by Nolly, and it's fantastically recorded, fantastically played, amazingly edited. So it's really, really nice to mix, and I'll just play you the unprocessed version. I haven't done any processing on this, I was going to do it with you. Cool. So that's the performance. Like I said, it's the verse line from Preposition, which is a metalcore track. So first of all, when I'm approaching this, I'm going to think, okay, so what do I want to prioritize in this mix? Obviously, I've got a lot going on in the kick. I've got a double kick there, and he's recorded 3 different tracks. And the snare, they've really, really thought about their snare choice. It's a really cracking, like in terms of tonally cracky snare. Then I think, okay, what's going on in the rest of it? There's a lot of cymbals going on. There's a lot of splashes, lots of ride, lots of crash. Not necessarily that much detail going on in there. So do I really want that to be the center point of my mix? So I'm just going to listen to the cymbals. So as you can tell there, as you can see there, you know, there's not any intricacy going on there. When he was writing this, when he was playing it, he wasn't thinking, I want people to be directed towards, you know, what my right hand's doing on the crash or anything like that. So I'll keep that in mind when I'm mixing, thinking about when, you know, what do you want to prioritize. So, you know, just out the gate, I'm just going to make some volume adjustments. Everything's going to be changed as you go along. But, you know, just so I know what I'm prioritizing, so I'm going to have the kick and the snare fairly high. What have I got going on my toms here? So I've got a couple fills going on in there, but nothing too massive. As you can hear, there's a huge amount of spillover coming from these rack toms of cymbals. So I'm going to try and mix those down if I can. Maybe do a little bit of cutting, a bit of editing to really get those toms ringing when I want them, but not have that cymbal spillover too high. So I've mixed those back a bit. And then what have I got going on in the room? So this is going to be more cymbals and kind of like the roundness of the snare. Cool. So some really, really nice room capture. I know that sounds disgusting on its own, and it's definitely a mistake I made when I first started mixing drums, is that I'd hear these room captures and I think, God, they sound horrible, I'm not going to include those in my mix. Take them out, and then your mix really loses clarity and kind of like an overall feeling. It's quite hard to describe because it really does kind of bulk out everything. It does get the bulk of the toms in there. It gets a really nice crack from the snare. So don't write out your room mics. But again, I'm going to mix those a little lower just because I'm focusing on my kick and my snare here. Yeah, so I'm happy with that. Just kind of off the bat, I'm really happy with the volume relation between the kick and the snare there. They're quite equalish, which is something I tend to go for in a metal track because, you know, kick is so important. But the snare's riding slightly higher, and it's going to come through because it's got higher frequency in there. So first, I'm going to start off by EQing my kick. I'm going to be EQing on the kick bus rather than doing kick 1 and kick 1, 2, 3, kick 1, 2 and sub, but I'll play these two separately anyway. So kick 1, kick 2, and kick 3. Nice. Okay, so kick 1 is really, really toppy. That's obviously a microphone that Nolly's decided to put far inside the kick or hang over the beater. So I know it sounds odd, but I'm going to prioritize this one because in metal music you really, really like that percussive edge to your kick. Then kick 2, that's going to be your outer kick shell microphone, so that's going to be capturing all kind of like the roundness of the kick and the tone of the wood. Then kick sub. So I'm not sure what they've done there. I don't know if that's a separate microphone or if he's taken the tracking from kick 2 and done some EQ moves on it and then bounced it in. But anyway, so the kick 2 and sub kick are going to work together, and then kick 1 is kind of do its own separate thing to kind of have that percussive top end. So if I mute the kick, I'm going to make some EQ moves. I'll make some moves and then I'll talk you through what I've done. Cool. So that's just kind of like some quick initial EQ moves I would have made on this kick, and I'll talk you through them really, really quickly. So I've put a low cut filter here, just bringing it up to what have I put? 36 dB, 40 dB. Anything below 40, 45 dB isn't worth hearing. It's kind of just rumble, which you're going to get from live drum recordings. It's inevitable. You know, it's pushing so much air out through this kick. Mic stands are going to rattle. You know, it's going to vibrate on the floor. So it's always nice, you know, just to make that initial move. Okay, then here I've done a slight bump up at around 70, 77. I do this quite a lot, especially on metal and hard rock sounding tracks. So this frequency band is that frequency that really kind of hits you in the chest. It's quite hard to experience if you're just listening over headphones, but if you're in a live environment and they've ever hit the kick and you can kind of feel it in your chest, that's this 75 to 85 band here. I've then made a cut here, just a small cut, around 400 to 1K. It was sounding quite honky. I'll demonstrate that by just pushing it higher. So again, subtle, but it's just one of those things, you know, that in the context of a mix, it's going to open up more space here for a lead guitar. It's going to, you know, maybe some strings, vocals, something like that. Then this 3K, I've pushed up slightly. So this is kind of that presency tack region of the kick. And I am well aware that the kick is super bright, especially in this kick one anyway. But I really, really like that. And it sounds a bit too bright on its own in the moment, but I think in the context of the mix, it's going to sound, really good, and it's going to punch it through. And then I've just made a small shelf cut up here just to take out some of the spillover. Anything above 10K is kind of just air frequencies. Everything that sounds a little bit wishy-washy. So I've just made a small cut there. Just had a question from Luca. How do I get my hands on these stems, on these tunes? Cool. So there is a company called Nail the Mix, and you subscribe to them, and you get a bunch of stems, basically. At the start of the month, you then mix them, you send them in if you want to, and there's always a competition, and the best one wins a bunch of audio equipment. And then at the end of the month, with the engineer that mixed them, so this is the prayer position, so they got Nolly in, and he did a whole mixed rundown of how he mixed it, which I'm yet to watch, but that's definitely on my list. Cool, so that's kind of the EQ moves I made on this kick. So mixing a drum kit is a huge thing, so I'm only going to focus between the kick and the snare for you, otherwise, you know, we're going to be here all night. So now I'm going to do some snare. And I'm going to leave the kick in because it's always good to mix in context. So I've got, I'll just mute it quickly just so I can show you the different tracks. So I've got snare top. That's really percussive. A whole bunch of attack. He's hitting that really, really hard, which is really, really nice. And then snare bottom. So that's kind of like the rattle of the snare. That's your bottom end. It kind of gives it the sizzle. Is always the word I've used to describe that. Again, same philosophy as I had with the room mics. It doesn't sound good on its own. If this was your only snare sound, you'd be really disappointed. But in context, it really kind of like brings out a lot of the clarity in the snare, especially for ghost notes and all that kind of thing. Cool. So let's have a listen to the snare. Cool, so that's kind of all I would really touch on this snare because it's been recorded so well. The room sounds great. I'm not really fixing too many problems tonally, which is really, really nice. Sometimes if you've got a bad drum recording, you're digging around for ages finding problem frequencies. So all I've done here, that's probably a bit too high, I've made a low cut here just to get rid of some of that rumble like I talked about before, and just a little bit of kind of like extra low end that was coming off the snare, which soloed would make it sound a little bit fatter, but in the context of the mix, I wanted to cut a little bit more. And then I've made a slight cut around 200. As you can see, there's kind of like a resonance coming out of there. And I just wanted to tame that. I didn't want to take it out totally, so I've just made a small cut by 5 dB or whatever. You can see it here. So if I raise it up, you can really see that. And yeah, well, I like kind of tight sounding fat drums. I don't like resonances really, especially in a live setting. So I tried to find, you know, that harmonic point and then give it a little cut if I can. And then I've just made a high cut filter here, just again to take out some of those air frequencies. There's nothing going on here. Something I did there, which is a good tip for EQing, is when you're high cutting or low cutting, roll it off a little bit too far and then bring it back. So you can see, you can hear that I rolled it off to about 5.5K. You can hear I lost all that high dynamic range. Sorry, not high dynamic range. That high clarity, that high frequency range. So I rolled it back a little bit to the edge of that. So I was taking out, the maximum amount of unwanted frequencies without affecting the actual tone of the drum. Cool. So that's the EQ moves I would have made there. And then obviously, when you're on rooms, you're going to get a much bulkier idea of the snare tone. So just quickly. So even without making EQ moves on this room mic yet, I'm already really pleased with that snare tone. I think it's bringing out the best of what they were trying to find in that snare. And then it just takes out, just the little unwanted bits that you're always going to get during tracking. Unless you're programming drums, you're always going to have those issues. Cool. So, a little bit of compression. So let's work on the kick first. Cool. So that's just a really quick adjustment of what I would have put in my kick bus. So I'm taking it out by a 3:1 ratio, which is kind of a moderate ratio. I believe I'm knocking off 1 to 2 dB on this kick, which isn't too bad. Which is kind of what you want to do, especially with a player like this in the genre. So you want this to sit well dynamically. You want it all to be fairly consistent. But you can hear from the way he's playing, he's still really hard about where he's accenting these kicks, and the dynamic he's putting into it. You can hear, he's obviously thought about where he wants these different kicks to come in, and where he wants it to tie up with the bass, and the dynamic of that. So I didn't want to take away too much dynamic from him because he's thought about it, and it's obviously something he wants in the piece. But I also want it to be, nice and stable, especially as it's going to be kind of like fairly up front in the piece. Sorry. And then attack. I've chosen a pretty fast attack, just because I did want it to clamp down on those transients pretty quickly. I didn't want there to be too much kind of boominess or anything like that. But I've left enough space that that initial transient can get through. You can get that attack in there. You can get that kind of feeling in your chest, especially if you're mixing it live. But then again, everything gets flattened down after that. So I think that's a nice kind of compromise. A nice little compromise you can have there. And the release, I've set the release fairly fast. When I'm mixing metal, well, I say metal, core, death metal, anything with double kick, not so much like hardcore and all that kind of stuff. A little rule of thumb is that I like the compressor to return to 0 before the next big hit. Obviously, if he's doing like blast beats, you're never going to get that. But that's kind of just like a little aim. So you can see there that it's getting back to 0 mostly by the end of a kick phrase, which I quite like. So all this is doing is kind of like balancing out those dynamics in his kick without trying to take away too much from his playing style. So now I'm going to do fairly similar stuff in the kick. So when you're compressing, sorry, I'm going to do this very same thing on the snare. Important thing to look out for when you're EQing a snare is, again, what's the drummer going for? Is this intricate ghost note patterns? Is it just one big hit on the 3? What's his kind of plan here? So let's have a listen. Yeah, so it's mostly kind of like your big thwack on the 3, but you have still definitely got a few ghost notes in there. But again, they are still pretty hard hitting, so I'm not going to worry too much about losing those in the mix. But I still do want to keep some separation between those ghost notes and the main hits. So I'm going to choose the same compressor again. I really, really like it for drums. It's quite bright. Not sure what else to tell you, and it's got a built-in limiter thing if you want to use that. Cool. Cool. So I'm pretty happy with that, just as a quick listen through there. So again, it's around the same sort of ratio. I wanted to keep some consistency with the kick, and they record in the same place, so there wouldn't be much need for much difference there. And he's pretty consistent with the way he attacks that snare, so I don't have to push it really, really hard to really get it sounding consistent, which is really nice. I'm knocking off around 1 to 2 dB on every hit. Again, just to kind of smooth out those transients, just so it sits a little bit better in kind of the general mix. Attack, I've gone for a fairly quick attack here, just because it's a really kind of like bright, cracky sounding snare, which is really, really nice, but it can sound a little bit too bright and a little bit too in your face. So I did want to clamp down on that initial transient just a little bit more, just that stick attack. But because I've got a fairly low ratio and threshold, it's not going to do anything extreme, but it does just kind of tighten it all up a little bit more. And then a fairly slow release from the return. So it's still catching those kind of ghost notes sort of things, but it's not doing too much in terms of separating, in terms of bringing them up to the same level. Cool. Have a little listen. So I'll have a little listen between the relationship between the kick and the snare now. So I was reading the comments. Just check whether you can't see the plugins on screen when you open them. Can't see the plugins on screen. That's really weird. I hope up to this point I've explained them fairly well enough. Okay, so from now on I'll use stock Logic plugins. Okay, can someone tell me in the comments section quickly if I open like a stock delay or something? Can you guys see that on my screen? Catherine, can you Okay, so the thing the thing I've got on. Can you see what I've got on screen? It's got a few music notes, and I'm just twiddling the dial on it. Can you see that? No. Oh, that's weird. Thanks for letting me know, Luca, bub. That's really weird. I don't know why it's done that. It shouldn't do. It's all part of the same screen sharing thing. Anyway, okay. Well, I'll just have to describe in ridiculous amounts of detail then what's going on. Cool. So that's kind of the relationship I'm happy with between the kick and the snare, which are the focal points of this drum mix. I don't know if you guys know the track or not, but it's a pretty hefty. I'm going to use the dreaded word genty metalcore kind of track, and these drums really, really sit on top of it, and it really ties in with kind of like Misha's chugging and all of this kind of thing, and it just works great with that kick and the snare interlocking really, really well. So now I'm just going to set up some bus ends because I spoke about them earlier, and I'm just going to show you how I set them up. So I'm going to do a snare reverb send now, because, you know, why not? So I'm on the snare channel. Hopefully you guys can see this. I'm going to go to sends, bus, new bus, so bus 10. Pop that down here. Rename it drum verb. And I'm just going to here I'm going to dial in what I think is an appropriate amount of signal to be sending to that. Nothing too drastic. I'm shooting for -18 dB as a general. It gives me enough wiggle room to turn it up and turn it down without any sort of clipping problems or anything like this. Okay, I'm going to open a reverb plugin. I'm going to pretend that you guys can see it. I'm using Wave. Actually, no, I'm not. Actually, yes, I am. Never mind. I'm going to use Waves H verb mono. So, hopefully you can hear that reverb even if you can't see it. Quite a drastic reverb at the moment. It's mixed at 0 dB, so it's going to be pretty high in the mix. But it's nice to mix your reverbs high when you're working out what you're going to do with them. So, let's have a listen. So I'm happy with that reverb tone. I think you still get a lot of that, of the true snare tone in that. It's not muddy reverb. It's quite an honest reverb, if that makes any sense. Obviously, it's mixed too high at the moment, but it is just a little bit too bright. It goes into mixing live, then having a really, really nice recorded studio recording. Read some bits. Thank you for the point, Luca. Cool. So that's kind of where I was planning up on. Oh no, sorry. Obviously, keep asking me questions if you want to know anything at all. It doesn't have to be on mixing drums or vocals. It can be on mixing anything or tracking, or my approach to mixing live, working with bands, all of this kind of thing. It doesn't have to be exactly what I'm doing here. Ask away. Ask what my favorite color is. I might. But another thing I haven't spoken about, which I said I'll speak about, is stereo spreading and audio real estate. And I think this is something that is so obvious, but people overlook hugely. People spend the whole time in the EQ section trying to, uncover frequencies from each other because, the guitar's taking up a little bit too much of the vocal presence, But a lot of your problems in terms of separation can be solved using some really simple panning moves. So let's take drum kit for an example. That's what we've got up here. When I mix drums, and when a lot of people mix drums, they use the audience's kind of reference to the drum kit as a good starting point. So obviously kick and snare in the middle because they'll be on top of each other. The toms from high to low going right to left. Then cymbals, pans, overhead. I can just do that quickly for you, really quickly. So I'm going to keep kick in the middle, snare in the middle, toms, tom one. Oh, we've slightly done it here. So I'm going to have a pretty hefty pan on that. Go on. I bring my low tom down there, low tom even lower. Cymbals, hi-hats would be panned to the right. So I'm used to sitting behind the kit, so it's a bit odd. Splash would be to your left. Splash. So I've done some panning here, but nothing too ridiculous. And then this is already tracked in stereo. So if I put the whole thing together, hopefully, it conveys over YouTube. But we'll see. Instantly tell that there's so much more space in that mix now that you've now that I've just spread it out slightly. And the same with Doom. So when I'm mixing vocals, I tend to keep them pretty central because they are generally the focal point of the piece. So here I've mixed the main ones, the main vocals in red, straight down the middle. And then these kind of important doubles, but nothing too much going on. I've just pushed slightly to the side, nothing too drastic.
So come rain on my parade.
Nothing too drastic. I didn't push them too wide. A lot of people push everything as far out as it goes. But I like to tend to think about it. You have your vocals, your snare, you're kicking the bass down the middle. Just outside of that, you have your backing vocals, because it's still a focal point, which is why they're pushed just very slightly to the side. Outside of that, I like to have my synths, a little bit further, my guitar to my pads and my strings. So kind of the bulky orchestral stuff, the stuff with a lot of frequency information, which you really want to keep. You don't want to be cutting away at it, otherwise you're going to lose, the point of it. But again, you can't have it straight down the middle because it's not the focal point and it's going to get in the way of your vocals. So I tend to pan that out pretty far. Then stuff like piano and acoustic guitar, where I'd normally use the stereo pair to record them, so I'd have a right and a left microphone. They're then on kind of the out edges of your instrumentation. And then the further stuff I'd have would be my overhead left and overhead right over the drum kit. And then any additional room mics I would mix in low, quite harshly pan. That's preference to me, but it makes sense because I don't like cutting away too much in the EQ. I want to leave stuff, as tonally as tonally pure as possible, because people spend ages finding the right tones, and producers have done all this, and then there's me just digging around in frequencies, fucking it all off them, which isn't what I want to do. So really a pan does solve a lot of problems in maintaining tone and maintaining kind of like the freedom of the piece without having to take away from the frequencies and all that kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of how I'd approach those things. So EQ, compression, mix buses, parallel compression, reverb, delay. Wondering if there's any more questions. elaborate on software programs that people like to use. This is logical. Okay, cool. So I'll just talk about different software you can use. So this is Logic. I chose Logic today because it's what most people who are kind of starting out and mixing, in production, all that kind of thing are used to, because it's really, really clear and it's really good for songwriting and all of that kind of thing, and it comes with a bunch of plugins. So that's why I chose Logic today. I typically use Pro Tools, just because it's the industry standard and I'm used to it now. So sorry if my navigation around this has been a little bit slow. It's been a while. But there's a bunch of stuff available. Obviously, I mentioned Pro Tools, Logic, Reaper. Oh man, I've gone blank. Anyway, there's loads and loads of doors out there. And then you can external plugins, which unfortunately, for some reason, you guys don't see on mine. But there's a bunch of companies that do great things. People who don't know what plugins are, they're external pieces of software that mimic studio equipment. So compressors, reverbs, every sort of dynamic thing possible, every sort of modulation, pitch effect, reverb, auto-tune, all of that kind of thing can be bought separately on the side. But if you're starting off, I recommend it just because as soon as you open a project, they've done most of the routing for you. They've put everything through to your mix bus. You've clearly got a stereo out. You can see where all your inserts go. You can see all your EQs across the top. Whereas stuff like Pro Tools, where you can get more in depth and really kind of do complex routing and mixing easier, it's quite difficult and quite daunting to set up if you've never come across a DAW before. Has anybody got any other questions? Oh, and also you can use plugins live. You've just got to run it off a certain piece of software and have good enough desk, but it is absolutely possible to use it live. I got asked that question the other day. See what's else on my list. Annoying you can't see my plugins, otherwise I'll take you through some more interesting stuff. I could talk a little bit just in the last way and explain where people may contact you for further information. Cool. So if you guys want to get in touch with me, if you've got any questions or you want me to do some mix or blast sound or teaching or whatever you want, I'm on Instagram, on Facebook. Yeah, so Ben Jones, Ben Pasquini Jones, just look me up, give me a message or a message thing, and I'll see it there and all of that kind of stuff. That's where to get in contact with me. So what's your opinion on online mastering websites? Okay, I'm going to be totally honest with you. Don't touch them. Sorry for anybody who's spent money sending off their stuff to them. They run algorithms to kind of like determine what might best suit your mix, and they don't go through it like an actual mastering engineer would. They don't take the time to break down the tracks. Also, you've got to be really, really careful when you're using these online things that you're delivering it in the correct format, that it's the right loudness, all of this kind of thing. You've got to have your mix basically like absolutely nailed before you send it off to them. Otherwise, like a normal engineer, sorry, a mastering engineer, if you send it off to them too loud, they'll get in contact with you. They say, oh, I need these stems, or oh, there's too much compression on the output bus. Can you take off some compression, or all of this kind of stuff. With these kind of things, they won't. They'll just kind of bang on any old, I call it like filter mixing, and all of that kind of thing. So no, I wouldn't use it. but it is a much better solution if you're on a budget than doing it yourself if you've never mastered before, if that makes any sense before at all. Will Rugget, do you ever find yourself using parallel compression on a drum mix? Hello, Will. I absolutely do. I should have probably covered that. I use it on the snare a lot, especially if what's the best way to explain this? If I'm using sample replacement on the snare, so the snare's not strong enough, or the player isn't super experienced, and each hit is slightly different, and I just want to kind of tighten it up, I may use sample replacement, but alongside with sample replacement, I'd use parallel compression just to have it kind of like really, really pushed and consistent. But I would mix the parallel compression quite high on that one because I quite like quite a high compressed snare. But again, it's totally taste. I wouldn't parallel compress like a jazz drum kit. Something, like a grind sort of thing, or electronic drum kit or something like that, like absolutely would. But really depends what you're doing. The best way to find stuff out is just to experiment. Like I said, there's no hard and fast rules for what works and what doesn't work. It's really to taste and can you make it work in the context of your mix. And if you're in your studio and you're thinking, oh god, I don't know where to start, just try some stuff out. You might really like it. Worst case scenario, it doesn't work in the mix, and then you can just take it off. No harm done by experimenting. Lex LeRae, will you be doing any more of these? Doing a killer job, mate. Thank you, Lex. Potentially, I don't know. We'll see how. I don't know. We'll see how all this goes. See how much longer we're in lockdown. If I were to do another one, what would you guys like me to cover? Because obviously I've covered kind of the real basics of mixing drums and vocals here. Would you guys like a full mix rundown of something I've already mixed? Or would you like me to go through something from scratch, or talk about live sounds more next time? Or what would people like? Let me know, or give me a message later. How are you doing on time, Catherine? Yeah, last call for questions, and then I'll be off. And again, the website's called Nail the Mix if you're looking for stems to practice with. That's where I got all these from. Cool. Absolutely. Cool, guys. I hope that this has been helpful. If you've never come into mixing before, you've got a little bit more understanding of, what basic stuff does, like EQ and compression. Or if, you've done a lot of mixing and you just want to see how somebody else approaches it. I hope you've found it interesting. If you want any work done or any questions or anything like that, just ping me a message at any time. We've got all the time in the world. Yeah, so thank you very much.